Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Joe Cannon Health Podcast. I am Joe Cannon. Welcome. This is episode number 36. If this is the first time you're joining me, welcome. I'm your humble host. My name is Joe Cannon. I'm an exercise physiologist, and it is my pleasure to bring you insights into my 25 years of investigating health, wellness, dietary supplements, rhabdomyolysis, basically everything under the sun regarding to health, wellness, nutrition, you name it, all without the hype, no spin, no testimonials, just the facts in plain English, hopefully. This week, I have an interview with Tom Shanahan. Tom is actually a civil rights attorney, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. Rather, we're going to discuss Tom's recovery from drugs and alcohol. Tom is a very interesting individual. He's actually written an entire book on how he recovered from drug and alcohol abuse. It's called Spiritual Adrenaline, a lifestyle plan to nourish and strengthen your recovery. In the next hour or so, he's going to talk about the 12-step program and also incorporating health nutrition into the program to help people stay healthier. We actually talk about a whole wide array of topics. I think it's going to be a very interesting interview. I think you're going to get a lot out of this, regardless of whether you have a drug or alcohol problem, because we talk about the larger issue of addiction. And I don't mean addiction to drugs and alcohol, but addiction to anything. And so Tom actually has some insights that I think may open people's eyes a little bit more to the whole idea of being addicted to anything, whether it's your cell phone or whatever. So I think this is going to be a very interesting episode for everybody. But before we get into our interview with Tom, let's talk about the myth of the week. Now, I started basically talking about dietary supplements a long time ago. It was actually probably the mid 80s, late 80s. I've seen a lot over the years, and one of the things that I want to talk about today is one of the things that I think is still prevalent these days, and that's the idea that maybe beta-carotene supplements can prevent cancer and heart disease. This is something that I think some people probably still think of, and to that idea, you can still go into health food stores and you can see and buy beta-carotene supplements. I don't recommend it, and here's why. Back in the 80s and 90s, people used to say, why is it that when people eat fruits and vegetables, they get less cancer and heart disease and other problems? And back then the thinking was, well, what's the common denominator of all these foods? Beta-carotene, they would say. And so the idea was, well, why couldn't we just take a beta-carotene pill and that would protect us against cancer and heart disease? And that was kind of the thinking until probably the late 1990s when researchers finally got around to looking at this. And so they conducted some investigations where basically they recruited hundreds of thousands of people and they gave them a placebo or beta-carotene supplements. They wanted to see what would happen. Well, they didn't get the result that they thought. In fact, one of the investigations was stopped early because it was unethical to continue it. In people who smoked or used to smoke, or those who worked around asbestos, they noted that beta-carotene supplements, not only did they not prevent cancer and heart disease, but they actually led to an increase in lung cancer. Let me say that again. People who smoked, used to smoke, or worked around asbestos had a significantly increased risk of getting lung cancer when they took beta-carotene supplements. And it was significant. It was, depending on what study you looked at, it was anywhere from 18% to about 28%. I always remember one of these researchers on the radio one time, and he was being grilled by one of the reporters, and he basically said, why is it that these supplements appeared to be causing lung cancer? And the researcher said something that always stuck with me, and he said, there's hundreds and hundreds of carotene molecules. That's true, there are. When you eat a carrot, you're getting not just beta-carotene, you're getting alpha-carotene, beta-carotene, delta-carotene, epsilon-carotene. Again, food for thought. When you see beta in front of a word or alpha in front of a word, remember that there's probably more than one. So carrots and foods that contain beta-carotene, they're not going to cause lung cancer. But when you take something out of food and you concentrate it in a capsule, you may get a result that's very different. Remember, the phytonutrients in food often play very nice with each other when they're in the food. But when you take something out of the food and you take a whole lot of it, you may get something very different occurring. So I honestly can't recommend beta carotene supplements for anybody. And I would say if you are taking them, I would suggest that you ask your doctor, your pharmacist, why, do I need to be taking this? I can't think of a reason why. And especially in smokers and former smokers, and even those who are working around asbestos, I absolutely would not recommend beta carotene supplements. So this is a myth, and it is a giant myth busted. Beta carotene does not prevent cancer and heart disease or anything else. And I honestly would say if you're interested, in getting more phytonutrients, just eat a better diet, eat more foods that contain beta carotene. So there you have it. There's the myth of the week. Now, if we leave the myth for this week, let me delve right into my interview with Tom Shanahan. Again, I think you're going to get an awful lot out of this. We talk about a whole wide variety of topics related to addiction and recovery. And again, this is something I think will be applicable to not only those who are struggling with drug and alcohol problems themselves, but people in general who may be addicted to other things as well. So without further ado, let's get right into it with my interview with Tom Shanahan. So we are here with Tom Shanahan today, and I got to tell you, Tom, last year when you gave me a copy of your book, Spiritual Adrenaline, I really had no idea everything that you have been through in your life. And when you wrote me some really nice words in the book. I'm looking at it right here in front of me, and I've looked through a good amount of this book, and I'm like, wow, it's a 300-page book, and you've even got your references broken down by chapter, which is impressive. I'm amazed at what you have come through. And, so I wanted to, again, bring you on, especially since you gave me this book. You were in the back of my mind, I wanted to bring you on originally. But one of the things that I want to do with my podcast is reach out to people that I don't think are getting reached out to. And those with addictions are absolutely in that classification. What is one thing you think people don't realize about addiction?
I think that one of the things that people don't realize is that there's a lifestyle that usually comes along with an addiction to a substance, but also addictive behaviors. And, abstinence from the substance doesn't necessarily alone help people, number one, achieve sobriety, but also to stay sober. And I think that the lifestyle that often accompanies addiction, which can be a lot of, many cigarettes, smoking, I smoked at one point 2 packs a day, eating processed foods and drinking huge amounts of coffee and everything, whenever possible, eating refined sugar, in the coffee and the foods. That kind of a lifestyle makes it harder to stay sober and to be healthy in sobriety. And so I think that for whatever the reason, what I call the self-care lifestyle, that really is what I think should be described as a sober lifestyle, oftentimes gets overlooked.
That's really interesting. Yeah, there's a TV show right now, which you're probably familiar with, which deals with women who are alcoholics. It's called Mom. And I think for many people, that's probably their first, maybe their main interaction with people who have addiction problems. And you really just opened my eyes to that, because when I do watch that TV show, they eat a lot of, cookies and cakes and stuff like that. And it never occurred to me until you had just brought that up.
Well, the reason what precipitated me to write the book was, all right, after about 6 to 8 months of being quote unquote sober, and I call it in recovery, and I got sober on May 11th, 2011, I had put on a very substantial amount of weight. And I was actually smoking more cigarettes in early recovery than I was at the end of my active addiction phase. And I noticed that I was eating, like I would sit with someone at a table and eat all of the bread out of the bread basket. And I'm not joking, I would look around the restaurant and be like wanting to grab the bread out of other baskets. And it was just bizarre behavior, but I started to get interested. First of all, I started to say to myself, if you keep adding weight at the rate you're adding it, you're going to be very unhealthy. And I was already feeling like lethargic and just not good. And secondarily, I wanted to understand why I had this compulsion to eat, like, French fries, white rice, anything with a high amount of carbs in it. And so I started to study, the science behind it. And I also would go to these 12-step meetings. And I'm a big fan of the 12-step program. in my book, I actually integrate exercise and nutrition into the 12 steps. But when I would go to the meetings, I would be part of the group outside smoking before the meeting. I usually take a break during a 1 hour meeting for a cigarette. The first thing afterwards, I would join the group having a cigarette after. And at the meeting, there was more often than not, the cookies and donuts and coffee and sugar and all that kind of thing. And I started to really come to realize this wasn't necessarily the lifestyle that has developed around the 12-step community isn't necessarily consistent with the long-term goals of the program, which is not only to abstain from a drug of choice or behavior of choice, but to be healthy and sober. And that's when I got interested in studying the reasons why, and that's what precipitated me to write the book.
That's really interesting. So exercise and nutrition is normally not covered in the meetings or the 12-step program, I'm guessing, right?
Well, it's interesting because at meetings, many of what I call the old timers in the 12-step world consider nutrition and exercise to be outside issues, right? And what that means is, let's say you're going to AA. The primary purpose is to stop drinking alcohol. So you're not really supposed to be sharing about what they call outside issues. And the same thing is in theory for Narcotics Anonymous, et cetera. And so that's what many people had that understanding. So when I was writing the book, because I said to myself, I was really surprised, and I had heard that Bill W., who's one of the founders of AA, actually had made nutritional recommendations to members. And this was kind of in a conversation I had with someone who was very knowledgeable about the founding of AA. So I wrote to AA World Headquarters, and they gave me access to their research library, and also Stepping Stones, which has a research library and retains all the records from Bill W. And I found the documents that spoke to this issue back in the 1930s and 40s. And so Bill W. actually had come up with a list of foods: French fries, white bread, pastas, that he called the sister foods to alcohol. And he recommended that people avoid those foods. And then also, there's only one documented example, but it's a guy named Eddie, who was one of the original folks that they were trying after Bill W. and Dr. Bob got sober. They were trying to help him stay sober. And they experimented with foods to see, because he was what they call the constant relapser. And so they did these experiments, and they found that when he would eat sauerkraut, for example, when he would eat baking soda and ketchup and some combination of these foods, that he had a tendency to be able to stay sober longer than when he ate the really sugary or highly refined sugars, or some of the sister foods that Bill W. identified. And so I say this, Joe, because somewhere along the way that message got lost, but it's right there in the archives for people to go confirm this. And also in my book, I have all the citations to the authorities I relied on. And just one more point on that is that Bill W. felt so strongly about this that he started to experiment both himself and with others. 30 members of AA were in a quote unquote pilot research program undertaken by Bill W. In how niacin, or the B vitamins, could impact how alcoholics felt in the context of depression, because Bill W. suffered from depression throughout his life. And for him, niacin supplementation really helped modify his mood. And so there's a lot of scientific reasons why that could be. So he had this experiment with 30 members of AA. About 10 of them saw benefits when they were taking these supplements. And so that's the history. It's there, but you don't hear much about it in the current 12-step community.
Wow. So even back in the 1930s, they were viewing the processed foods as almost like a gateway drug to relapse, it sounds like.
Yeah, they refuse. That's a really good way to put it. It's definitely has the same. I'll put it this way: Dr. Silkworth, Duncan Silkworth, was a doctor at that time who was one of the few who actually would work with alcoholics and trying to many had been put into institutions, but he wanted to get to the bottom of why people were so compelled to drink. And so he came up with the allergy theory, that the reaction of alcoholics to alcohol and other certain foods, like for example, the sister foods, was akin to an allergy. They had this allergic reaction to it. So he brought some additional thinking to the situation. But yeah, I mean, this goes way back. This recognition that nutrition and lifestyle choices can really play a role in people's ability not only to be abstinent, but to achieve sobriety.
Wow. Has the AA community embraced your linking the program to exercise and better nutrition?
That's an interesting question. So I just wrote a letter to AA World Headquarters because we started a group in New York City called Sober Active NYC. And I asked for permission to make some changes, as many other groups have done, to the 12 steps to include nutrition and exercise. And so they sent us back a letter saying, you can use your modifications, just make sure you have an asterisk saying that this is not endorsed by us. So, it's a very good question because traditionalists in the 12-step world do not necessarily agree with our integration of lifestyle issues into that program. However, there's a huge new emerging area in the addiction recovery field known as the Sober Active movement. And these, in my book, each chapter tells the story of someone who's a part of that movement. Scott Strode from the Phoenix, which is now, I think, in about 15 states. I consider him the founding father, if you will, because Scott was the first to really organize people in recovery around CrossFit. And he now has gyms and all kinds of programs, surfing programs in California. I mean, he does great work. He was the first to really organize successfully people around like a healthy lifestyle. Rob Archuleta and his wife, Sheena Archuleta from Pueblo, founded Addict to Athlete. And what all these programs do, and they're not all necessarily 12-step programs, some are and some aren't in the sober active community, but they recognize that this healthy lifestyle is of critical import. And what's important about this whole movement that's taking shape is that Addict to Athlete, for example, has been studied in the state of Colorado, has paid to have people who have participated in their program audited to see how they've succeeded. And the success rates, for what I mean by success is achieving long-term sobriety, are much higher for people who integrate the healthy lifestyle. And I think that's for obvious reasons. But again, there's different schools of thought, and it doesn't mean that what I'm advocating is right or wrong. It's just a different school of thought.
Sure it is. Absolutely. If we set aside the exercise and nutrition from the equation for a moment, what do you think is the biggest pitfall for people who are trying to break their addiction? What makes them relapse the most, if there is one thing?
Well, I think what makes it hardest is that, they say people, places, and things. Mm-hmm. And we're speaking now at a time, Joe, where the coronavirus is taking a huge toll on our country and the world, And I think the reason I bring it up is because, just generally speaking, there's a large segment of the American population that believes in, this is my opinion, that a pill can solve the problems for us. And there's a large segment of the population that also believes, that also believes that like exercise and nutrition are not, for example, a component of continuing in good health and avoiding medical concerns. What I'm saying is this: when people come in, the statistics are as follows. When people come into inpatient treatment, the studies show that people coming into the inpatient treatment arena are between 60, depending on the study you rely on, to 90% are either type 2 diabetic or have hypoglycemia. And I mention this because I think that it's very hard, because society, everywhere you go, if you go to a sporting event, you see alcohol as the major advertiser that supports the events. If you go to a restaurant, you see so many of the really refined sugars or really carbohydrate-rich foods. When I look at Consumer Reports' review of new meals being offered in fast food restaurants, and I see the number of calories in one meal can often be what I eat in a day, and so I think it's just really hard to be in a society where not, there's a large amount of people who just don't value that healthy lifestyle or engage in the healthy lifestyle, and to try and lead it or to change your ways from active addiction and continue.
That's a really interesting viewpoint. You, again, another light bulb just went off in my head. It's almost like, at least here in America, we have an addiction culture. They want us to be addicted to a new car every year, or that new clothing line every year. They literally do. And one of the things that drives me crazy is they call us consumers. And I rebel against that. Like, I'm not a consumer, I'm a citizen. But they literally call us consumers. They want us to consume. They want us to be addicted to whatever it is they're selling. And so that's a really interesting point, that it's tough to break your addiction when so many other, I guess, companies are vying for your addiction to their product. So very interesting.
Well, I mean, so much of the marketing. By the way, I saw a movie called The Queen of Versailles. I don't know if it's about consumerism and just how it's impacting American culture. It's an excellent movie. But so much of what's being marketed is designed to addict. And for people like me who have a tendency towards addictive behaviors, like, for example, social media is designed to addict. The number of likes, is timed. I'm not an expert in this, but is timed to maximize the endorphin rush. These, I think, increasingly our culture and technology, which we rely on, is designed to, again, to keep you coming back, whether it's good for you or or bad for you, but to keep you coming back. And I think, again, the fact that so many people now, when I go on the subway in New York City, or when I used to go on the subways in New York City on the way to work every morning, I see people, I'm not talking about people who necessarily identify being in addiction recovery, but they can't put their phone down.
Yeah, I know.
It's just like, I have seen, Joe. So, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I live in Midtown. I work in Midtown, another part of Midtown. And so oftentimes I'll walk across town instead of taking the bus or the subway. I've seen a number of people almost walk into traffic.
Yeah.
Because they're texting so relentlessly and not paying attention.
Yeah.
I see, good Samaritans will stop them. Mm-hmm. But it's like, it's mind-boggling to me.
Me too.
It is. But I also think, like, again, if you're eating lots of junk carbs and if you're drinking a lot of caffeine and you're getting all hyped up, it intensifies the texting and intensifies that kind of the inability to break free the device and actually live in the world where you are, be present and aware of your circumstances all around you. So I think all these things have made it harder for people to stay sober, in the contemporary world.
So interesting. Yeah, I was out driving yesterday. I did just literally see somebody walking across a busy street, looking at her phone, not even looking at me. And I see that a lot. Are people walking their babies and in a carriage, and they can't look away from their phones? So you're right. It's a huge addiction. So I guess it makes sense. It'd be tough to break any kind of addiction in this culture, where everybody, again, is vying for your time, whether it's social media or,
But they're also spending lots of money. You know this.
Yeah.
They're spending lots of money to test what, for example, what time do we release the likes because it'll maximize the endorphin rush, And so, like, to have, for example, the technology companies doing that is one thing, but this and I know this. Food companies are doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They're figuring out the quote unquote bliss point on their products to maximize that same thing. Those feel good hormones, the point at which people can't stop, eating whatever it is, tomato sauce, chips. And so we're getting it from all sides. And I really do believe, and this is true in addiction recovery, but also in the consumerism and addiction to products, et cetera, there's a lot of money in addiction. There's a lot of money in relapse. And when people get sober, there's just not a lot of money that goes into, like, the economy in the sense of the healthcare. Addiction, treatment, and relapse is a billion-dollar industry. So my point is, unfortunately, and I think knowledge is power. I'm not trying to sound like negative about our country or society or anything like that, but I think you have to be aware of these things. I spoke in Colorado in January. I gave the keynote at an addiction recovery conference. And one of the points I made was for the counselors to understand they should communicate to their clients in the inpatient facilities when they say, why can't I eat just one Dorito? Why can't I eat just one cupcake? Why can't I eat just one, this or that? That to explain to them that these foods are being manipulated to be the most addictive as most addictive as possible. So the people don't believe that they're weak. They need to understand that there's a lot of money going into how to hook them. And when people have that kind of knowledge, when they really understand that, I think it makes them understand that maybe they're not, again, they can get past this if they understand what's being done and what's happening and the consequences of, their choices on what they're eating and other elements of their lifestyle.
Given how hard it is, how did you overcome that, say, little voice inside your head that said, maybe you didn't have it. Can I break this addiction? Can I really do this? How did you break? Because you, again, looking at your book, you had some addictions. I mean, the alcohol and the drugs and the smoking, and wow.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the smoking was 24 years, and I'll be honest with you, that was the hardest addiction to give up.
Yeah,
because it's so well accepted, even though things have changed. But here's what happened with me is I met somebody who really got me thinking about these things, and then I took the new sports nutrition exam with you in Baltimore. I think it was 2013. I didn't pass, so I had to go back. That's okay. I don't hold it against you. I didn't, I wasn't ready. That's how I look at it. And I wound up taking it again. And it was a really good experience. And then when I got certified, I wanted to learn more. But the more I learned, this is why I say knowledge is power. I kind of got angry. I started to think about it, and I realized, just like a drug dealer sells you false hope in many ways and tries to keep you hooked, so do many companies, right? Yeah. And none of it was good. I was smoking at one point in recovery 2+ packs a day, and I just decided my health was deteriorating. I had blood work done, and it was not positive. It was my doctor told me, you have a 2.5 times increased risk of heart disease. You're pre-diabetic, all these different things. And so that got my attention. And then the more I learned, and I also was watching people who wasn't relapsing at recovering, 12-step meetings and all this. And I found it was, and I could see very different lifestyle between the different groups. And so I started to want to learn more. That's when I got certified. That's when I started to take it seriously. And here's the thing that's like, it's hard to understand when you're where I was, but it's a lot of work to feel so shitty. Can I say that on your podcast?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it took a lot of work and it was very expensive. So like when over time, as I started to modify what I'm eating and started to eat healthier, the cigarettes seemed less appealing, right? I could barely walk a city block without wheezing. And so I started to just feel really good. And it got addictive too, because I was like, okay, so if I can, just by cutting out late night coffee, cutting out the refined sugar, and making what I in the beginning were very small modifications to my diet, I can feel this good. I want to see what I could really feel like if I could do XYZ. So it took me 2 years after quitting alcohol and drugs to quit the cigarettes. But let me tell you something. 6 months after I quit the cigarettes, I felt so amazingly good. I had no idea what it felt like to not. I felt awful every morning. I wanted to quit every morning when I woke up, and just how good it felt. And my skin looked better. Without telling people, I got compliments. So my point to you is, like, healthy living can get as addictive as the negative choices we make, because you want to continue to feel good. And I mean, I'll tell you, with integrating the exercise, I'm 52 now. I have 6-pack abs, which I didn't even have in my 40s. I compete in men's physique competitions. And my blood work now is better than my blood work was when I came into recovery at 44 years old. I test it preemptively every 6 months with a sports medicine doctor in Maine. His name is Dr. Michael Beedix. And we go over the results and we modify my nutrition and what else, exercise, to try and maximize the various elements in my blood markers. And so he now describes my blood work as equivalent to a 25-year-old Ethiopian marathon runner. Seriously. And I used to be a 22-year-old Ethiopian master. That about 3 years ago. So I'm getting older. So now he says it's a 25-year-old. But I make this point, Joe, because what you teach is critical. I mean, the nutritional tips, I've read, I actually have it here with me, Nutritional Supplements, one of your books.
Yes.
You teach the import of eating right, and you teach the science behind it. And so I wish, and you taught me, I'm one of your students. So, but it's hard to see the internal changes, right?
Yes.
And so that's why in the book, I have a whole chapter that speaks to the issue of why it's important to get your blood work done, to have those metrics so that you can accurately see it. Because I was astounded 1 year after I started to make these minor changes, when I went back and Dr. Beedix went over my blood work with me, and it had improved dramatically. And that really felt great. And you really can't see that. So even though I say I have a six-pack abs because I compete in men's physique and I do that to inspire other people, it's not so much the aesthetics that matters. It's what's going on the inside, right? In the context of our health. And these changes and living healthy, eating healthy, not all the time. I love pizza. I love burgers, I like cheeseburgers, but the balance is good. That's not what I eat all the time, I stay away from the processed foods, but, when you start to see that your liver function's improving and your kidney function's improving, especially when we're faced by like the coronavirus, it's really important to be in good health.
Yeah, I agree. Health is the best wealth, and we take it for granted. I'm always amazed we don't fall apart. We're so complicated. I'm glad you did mention that smoking was the hardest thing to kick the habit to. I've seen it myself. I'm just passing 22 years since my mom and my dad died, both of smoking related cancers. And again, I saw firsthand how hard it was. My mom could not quit. It's just horrible. I wish that cigarette companies would be eradicated from the face of the planet. It has changed my life forever. My mom she might still be alive, but if it wasn't for that. But yes, congratulations to you. And
I'm sorry to hear that about your mom and dad. I can tell you, I remember just sitting there. I quit alcohol and cocaine, but I'm not going to be able to break this cycle. You know what helped me a lot? I went to nicotine. This may help someone out there. We have Nicotine Anonymous meetings in New York City. And if there's a lot of them these days, but if they don't have them where people live, you can go online and you can actually do them online. So I went to this meeting in the Seafarer House, which is off of Union Square in New York City. So I decided I was going to keep going. Until I could quit. And I sat next to someone who had an oxygen tank. And there was a couple of other people there who had very major difficulty breathing, and they would share about their situation. And when you see that, and when you hear them speak, I could not, in good conscience, it just got me thinking. I just cannot light up. I mean, and the people who would be, God bless them for sharing, because it helped me. But I'll never forget someone there in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank talking about, Joe, and I'm not exaggerating, the first thing I'm going to do when I get out of this meeting is light up a cigarette. And I can't fucking walk. That's what the person said. But as soon as I get out of here, I'm going to light up a cigarette. And you just sit there going,
yeah,
that, that hits home.
Yeah.
And so one of the gentlemen who was also struggling with me at that time to quit, we both have about the same amount of time now, which is, I'll have 7 years in September. His name is Nick, and we message each other on our anniversaries. So I say that because it worked for Nick too. to go there and to hear these stories from people, you have to force yourself to see the dark side, right?
Yeah.
Because all the advertising tells you it's glamour.
Yeah.
And that's like in your folks' situation, I guess back then, I would think like in the movies, everyone was allowed to smoke.
Hmm.
Um, you could smoke on planes. All these. It was everywhere. So I feel for your loss. Just it gets under my skin to think that these companies can still operate
Yeah.
legally in this country.
I agree. It's a horrible thing, and I look forward to the day when nobody smokes ever again. But you mentioned something interesting. Somebody had actually helped you. So if someone is, say, addicted to, say, nicotine, alcohol, whatever, and they're going to meetings, I know that some people can have a sponsor if they choose to.
Right.
How do you pick a good sponsor? What are some questions you would do? Do you interview a sponsor? I mean, how does that work?
For me, and this is, I think I write about, yeah, I do write about it in the book. Okay, so I was going to meetings, but I hadn't met anybody who I really thought I'd like to be my sponsor. And then I was at the gym, and there was someone there who had a pretty good body. Everyone seemed to respect. And I found out that that person was in the program. And so I approached them and I said, oh, would you be my sponsor? Because I figured that's what I want to be like, right? I want to look that healthy. I want people to like be looking up to me. So he was the one who got me really thinking. He was at the gym more than at specific meetings. I would go to meetings in the morning and then usually work out around the same time he did. And he was my first sponsor, and we're still good friends today. And so I think like, if you're at a meeting, you should really listen to what people are talking about when they share. If someone's talking about, listen, I went to work out today, I went hiking, I went on this trip to wherever, I've been to, I don't know if you're aware, I went to, I summited because I want to do things in my vacation time where I celebrate being free, sober and healthy. So I summited Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. Last October, I went to the base camp at Mount Everest. I did a hike on a 4-day Inca trail to Machu Picchu. I was about to lead a trip this year, but it was been canceled because of what's happening. I didn't summit, but I went up to the glacier on Mount Rainier in Washington State, which is about 11,000 feet, and I did some ice climbing up on the glacier. So my point is, there are people who share about these things in meetings, and if you go hang out at the gym, if you go to an AAI ISMA convention, which is where I met you,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to meet, I think, healthy-minded people. And if you're hanging around a bar or a crack house, you're going to meet people who are good influences. And so there's a lot of people, and that's why I created my Facebook page and website. We have 80,000 Facebook fans on the page now.
Wow.
And it's become the home of what we call the sober active movement. I tell stories of other people in almost every the country in the Western world, like in the sense of Europe, Canada, Ireland, UK, here. It's a great place to network and to meet other people who want to integrate these two things. And by the way, if someone finds a sponsor who is more traditional in the sense that he or she believes these are outside issues, that's fine. It doesn't preclude them from meeting a different group of people who maybe meet at the park on the weekends and do kind of workouts or hikes or whatever it is. And it's really great because this is the time. There's an entire movement happening all over the country and the world, and we were planning. We'll see what happens now with, obviously, we're speaking during the coronavirus pandemic. Our goal was to have the first sober active conference in New York City next spring, where we would host people from all over the world to come and to really get to know each other and meet and talk about these different issues, with the idea that the conference would then be moving around the United States and the world to Europe, the UK, and Canada, for example, where we had really large groups of people who are interested. So if they visit my website, again, it's all free. I have a YouTube channel with over 200 videos. People can go watch them. A lot of the major players and people who are really the leaders and making things happen in the community are interviewed on that YouTube channel. And one thing I wanted to mention is it's so cool because the people in the community are so cool. Like a lot of the organizations have started. For example, I met Scott Strode earlier from the Phoenix. He doesn't like to talk about it publicly, but he's donated money to many of the other major organizations that when they were getting started that are now very active groups, and I won't mention their names, but he gives seed money, support, and there's other people who do it too. So it's a great group of people, and it's a great time to try and get sober.
That is wonderful. Yeah, I'm going to link to your Facebook page, YouTube page, etc., your book, so everybody can check out more.
Thank you.
No, definitely. It's a great resource. Again, this is an aspect of our society that does not get a lot of attention, at least not as much as I think it should, because again, we live in this culture of addiction, and they want to keep you, in that loop one way or another, and you're trying to, which is a good. When you were starting your journey, was there one piece of advice that stuck out to you more than any others? What's some advice that really made you get up and get out of bed in the morning?
With me, I always knew what the right path was. I had been I was a soccer player and the captain of my high school swim team, and actively involved in sports in college. And then I also started flirting around with cocaine in college as just a side thing that was fun, and it took over everything, right? But I always knew the right track, and I knew I wanted to get back there. And if I wanted to get back, I don't mean this in a bad way, but if I wanted to get back to that healthy lifestyle, it wasn't going to happen if I stayed around to quote unquote 12-step or recovery world, right? I had to integrate. This goes back to 2012 though, 2011, 2012, because it is different now. But I had to also go to the gym and integrate a different way of life. And so here's the one thing, since this was a really important. It's funny how these little decisions along the way that seem inconsequential can be so important. So I remember one night, a bunch of the guys from a meeting that I went to were going out for pizza, and then there was some, not involving alcohol, but some late night poetry reading or something up in Portland, Maine. So I figured by the time we got there, we'd get home around 2:30 in the morning, whatever. And I remember sitting at home and just journaling, saying, that's something I would always find appealing. But I had been getting up early in the morning and seeing the sunrise up in Maine, and it was spectacular. And then I go to the gym right afterwards, and I loved the way I felt after I saw the sun come up and then worked out, the nature, and then the physical workout. So I remember sitting there going, I'm going to skip tonight, and I'm just going to get a good night's sleep so I can see the sun come up the next day. And it profoundly changed. I remember really debating in my head that night, should I go? I want to see people. Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, stay in, get a good night's sleep, and just see that sunrise in the morning. Because once you start to see that beauty that you've missed for so long, it's really hard to make the other choices again.
And again, you mentioned about the recovery programs. Is there any, if there was one thing about the recovery programs out there that you would change, what would it be? What would you like to see done differently now?
You mean in the sense of inpatient treatment facilities, or you mean?
Yeah, or how they conduct the meetings, or
Okay, that's why I'm asking. There's a difference between inpatient treatment or the 12-step world.
The inpatient treatment.
Yeah. Okay. In inpatient treatment, I think they really must incorporate more of a holistic approach. Because in the inpatient that I was at, and in speaking to hundreds of people, there's such a great reliance on the mental health, if you will, but not the physical health. But your head is attached to your body, or it should be, right? And so if one is not well, the other can't be well. And so I just think there's over-reliance on medication and, kind of talk therapy, if you will, and not much of an influence actually at all in the context of nutrition. But to some extent, it's changing in the context of exercise. Because I think what we're teaching, I think when people wind up where I was in Conifer Park in upstate New York, you need to relearn life skills and eating right and the exercise. Those are important life skills because otherwise, it just makes it harder to break the cycle of the people, places, and things that are always looking to drag you back into misery.
Amazing. Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned doing the holistic thing is great. You are also certified by the Institute of Integrative Nutrition. This question comes from a friend of mine who I told her we were doing this and mentioned this day, and she's like, find out about that because it's something that she was thinking about doing as a second career.
Okay.
And she retires. So if Tracy is listening, what could you tell her about the Institute of Integrative Nutrition? How you liked it, not stuff.
Let me just say one quick thing about the last question, because I think it's important. The New York Times ran a 2-piece series on inpatient treatment programs and how the thrust of the articles, and people can Google them, was when people are released from inpatient, they basically give you a meeting book and say, you're on your own, right? Because insurance isn't paying for them to be there anymore. And so the Times article, the thrust was, if we want people to succeed after they're being inpatient, we must give them the tools, right? And so the Times, it's a 2-piece article. It's really worth reading. And so this is not like what we're talking about. It's not new. And the question is, why hasn't it been integrated? Now, to integrative nutrition, I'm now 52, and so when I got sober, I was 44. So it didn't make sense for me to become a registered dietitian. I felt like I would have to do all the pre-med requisites, and then it was too long of a program. So I went to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition with the idea that I probably wasn't going to be a health coach. I'm an attorney, and I have been for 22 years. But I really liked the Institute, and I'll tell you why. They give you a well-rounded overview, and they have some real, like Dr. Oz is one of the presenters that do it via video, not live, but Dr. Weil is another one. And so you get, number one, the materials are out of this world, everything you'd want to know about these different dietary theories. And they give it to you in kind of a nutshell approach that when you figure out what it is that you are really interested in, you can develop your knowledge and develop your interest from there. I found it to be a really worthwhile experience. And I will say, I've actually taken some of their advanced training courses. I just finished an emotional eating course. That's taught, you have to finish the initial courses. And then this is an advanced course. It was the first time it was offered. Out of this world about the psychology behind emotional eating. Like I said, I just finished that, and they also had they have an advanced course in gut microbiota. I haven't taken that course, but I have taken another course in hormones, and so and how the interrelationship between enzymes in food and hormone production. It's a great place to get a really detailed and comprehensive overview of these issues, and then from there you can develop it even more. And that's kind of what I've done. I went to a conference in London in September of last year. It was the International Institute for Nutritional Psychiatry Research. There's an organization. It's only met twice. I learned about that at the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. And it's a great group of people all over the world that are now conducting research on how nutrition can be used as a component of a treatment modality in psychiatry. And so, it opens a lot of doors. And what your friend's name is, Valerie, I think you said?
Tracy.
Tracy, I apologize. Tracy, I highly recommend it. And if you have any other questions, just feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer any other questions.
Very good. I'll pass that along. I think that's a great idea. I think nutrition, psychiatry, they go hand in hand. I read in your book, one psychiatrist just gave you a bunch of medications at one time. And
he gave me 5 in 15 minutes.
Yeah. And I've heard that from other people. Not to badmouth them, but that's, it's a lot.
It's a lot. And, I think there's just like we talked about earlier, I think that this is what makes it so hard because there's a predisposition towards that. And Joe, you and I both know, and there's a book I cite in my book called The Drug Muggers. And, these medications that I was given And I was only, and I'm not exaggerating, I was there for 15 minutes with him. I met him one time, and he's a well-known pharmacologist whose name I won't mention, in New York City. But these drugs also impact, I know this now, like the gut microbiota, the ability of our bodies to, not just all the bacteria, not the bad bacteria, but all of the bacteria, good bacteria and bad bacteria, that impacts your mental health. I mean, it impacts if I would say I was depressed, I'll say I'll give you this pill for that. But it's not addressing why I'm depressed, right? And it's actually making it harder, from my opinion, for me to get out of that cycle, because it's impacting my bodies in ways that I wasn't even aware.
Right.
So I just think this is the big challenge here, and I'm wondering if people will start to take health more seriously, given where we are at this point in our history, what's happening all around us today. Because I just feel our healthcare system and the addiction recovery element of it is treatment facilities is involved, but it's this predisposition to rely on pharmaceuticals, as opposed to, no one ever said to me, and I say this in the book, when I went to, I only started to see these therapists when I went into treatment. Yeah, how much have you exercised? What do you eat? Like, sleeping, all these different issues that were really, I think, prerequisite questions before prescribing these. And one last point about that, I just want to, and I think this is one of the things that I knew when I was in rehab, I wanted to do things a little differently, because I would watch all my, the people that were there with me in the same ward, how excited they got to line up for the meds. That was the highlight of the day.
Wow.
And and it would happen multiple times a day. But people would be at that line early because they wanted to be in the front. Wow. And so, I remember that, thinking, I don't want to, I have to get this right. And thankfully, knock on wood, I had a lot of support from my family and all the rest. I got it right. I haven't been back. I have no intention on going back. And that's why I'm happy to be on your blog, is I want to share that experience. And I want other people who maybe they've tried it the more traditional way, maybe they've tried the pharmaceutical solution, who haven't succeeded. It may not be you. It may be the approach, right? So give it a try. Contact me. I return every message I get. If I can't help people, I refer them. And I know people all over the country, and in a lot of countries, Canada and Europe, that are into what we're talking about here. So if people live in England, London, I can help you out. I can refer you to somebody. There's no charge for that. I do it because I think it's the right thing to do. And I think what I've done, and this to be true, because you've been teaching health to people a long time. It's like, what I didn't expect when I started to eat right and exercise was a degree of self-esteem. It gave me, instead of self-doubt and believing what other people told me, it gave me the confidence to believe in myself. And so, I think there's so many benefits to this healthy lifestyle, and I would just like to see other people enjoy it as well.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. If you've been through a lot over the last decade, if you were to do one thing over again differently, what would it be?
I mean, since I got sober, or before that?
During your sober journey, is there one thing you said, I wish I had done that differently?
I ran for political office at the request of a number of people in New York City, and I won. It was a district leader position, which is like a junior city councilman. My district was 14th Street to 59th Street, and I went from like Broadway over to the river. And I wound up resigning 10 months after, because I had been very active in politics for years. I worked for Mayor Dinkins. I worked for 2 governors. I was a well-known civil rights attorney. And to be honest with you, and I want to be careful what I say in case anyone hear this, but you got to be on something to be involved in our political system. When I tried it sober, It's insane. It's insane. And so I called up some of the people who had supported me. I said, I can't do this. And they said, what, are you crazy? You just won. Everybody won. I said, I know, and I'm going to help whoever you appoint to replace me, but I can't do this. It's not good for me.
Wow.
And I stepped down. Yeah. So I would have stayed out of politics.
Well, then you just answered my question, because literally I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday. One of my, again, we're in this crazy time right now. And one of my, pet peeves is we get so many medicines from China. And one of the things that I was literally saying last night to somebody was, after the dust settles, I'd love to have us have a conversation where we make more medications over here. And I literally on the phone said, I don't know if that's ever going to happen, because there's no more Mr. Smiths going to Washington. Maybe I just got to run for office. And I laughed at myself when I said that. I'm like, yeah, who's going to vote for me? But based on what you just said, yeah, it's probably not the life for me.
Let me just say something about that, because we've discussed this. I don't know if you recall, but I saw you last year in Baltimore, and you raised that issue, and you said, God forbid we ever go to war, in front of the entire class. And I remember I was at the Baltimore conference. There's this issue where we're relying on China to produce our antibiotics. And so I think it's a hugely legitimate issue. The issue will become this: if you were to run for office, the pharmaceutical industry would put tons of money into anyone who ran against you. It's a fundamental problem in our system. And unfortunately, let me say, and I'll give you a real example. On the west side of Manhattan, the area that I represented briefly, in 2012, there was the only hospital we had with a trauma center was called St. Vincent's Hospital. And as an attorney, a civil rights attorney, I had sued the hospital when they tried to close. The argument was that they had driven the hospital into debt and able to justify closing it because the property was so valuable to the real estate community. And they wound up buying the St. Vincent's property and building these multi-million-dollar condos there. And so, like, at the time, people were saying there's only going to be 2 hospital beds on the entire west side of Manhattan. Do you understand what's happening here? And, there was a lot of pushback because the real estate industry is so powerful in Manhattan that we were bomb throwers and, we don't know what we're talking about. And then, you get to the present time and they're sending a hospital ship to dock in that neighborhood because there's no hospitals there. But the point I'm making to you is, I think the reality is, both from the pharmaceutical industry perspective, from how we approach healthcare, this has been a wake-up call, Joe, for a lot of the ways we've been doing business in this country for a long time. And, I think it's not about Democrat or Republican, because I think both sides are equally at fault for the situation we find ourselves in.
Yes.
And, I think my peeve on this, and then I'll shut up, but when you get me started on politics, I go crazy. is, we really need term limits, because the problem is these Republicans and Dems that are in Washington stay there for life unless they do something crazy, right? And they develop relationships with these industries, and they're not able to make the choices that are in our best interest. So I would vote for you. I'll donate money to your campaign. But I'm telling you, it's a complicated situation. It really is.
I know. And again, you're probably the only one. But yeah, I remember that day. I sometimes do, when I do talk, I do bring up that whole China thing, just to get people thinking, because I know it's not on their list. And it wasn't even on mine until I read a book about this about a year or 2 ago.
Well, it's also interesting that they developed so much of our medication for us. And they're also the place where all the major viruses seem to be coming from.
No doubt about it. Yeah.
I mean, come on. So it's like, I don't know. There's a lot to this. And I hope when things settle down, I hope people will look into that.
I really do hope so as well. So I'll be keeping an eye out for it. But this has been a great conversation, Tom. One last question for you. Are there any resources that you use often that you would like to share with other people? And I'll link to them here in my podcast.
Well, the major resource that I use is the NCBI database, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and PubMed. Yeah, I do look a lot there. Consumer Reports is
Hmm.
another one. Nutrition Action is wonderful. I
Yeah.
mean, I read their monthly newsletters and follow that through. And then I think that PubMed is probably most important. It's not a normal resource, but there's a number of researchers that are doing really innovative work in the area of addiction recovery. In my book, I have all those citations. Many of them are in the book. But if you follow different topics on NCBI database,
Hmm.
you'll start to see there's really people who are the prominent researchers in this area, and people can start to follow them and contact them, as
Hmm.
I've done. So
That's great. Tom Shanahan, this has been an eye-opening episode. I'm really glad we got a chance to connect. This has been a
talk about nutrition, politics, and everything.
yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I know everybody's going to get a lot out of this. And again, I'm going to link to your book, your website, your YouTube channel, your Facebook page, so people can check you out because you are doing some really good stuff.
Thank
Again,
you.
for an aspect of the population that I don't think gets a lot of attention. So, and again, when I read your story in your book, you hooked me with the very first sentence. You believe you have the genes for addiction. I do as well. Again, my parents were both drinkers, and it's one of the reasons that I don't drink at all. And
Right.
I wonder about that myself. So your book is very well written. It's a 300-page book, and you broke down the references by chapter. So I know that it's not a book you put together overnight.
Can I just say one thing about that, Joe? I meant to
Yeah.
mention this earlier, because when I was starting to learn early on, studying nutrition, I would read books that oftentimes were self-published. And I'm not putting down all self-published books, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And there were these like, for example, the vitamin cure to alcoholism. Intriguing, right? But I was looking for what's the science behind it, what supports that conclusion, and I was frustrated. And so I wanted to write a book where people could look and see if this is evidence-based. It's based on real research. It's based on credible scientific sources. And so that's how you teach. That's how you teach your class. You always have citations when I've attended your sports nutrition classes.
Thanks for noticing.
Yeah, well, it matters. It matters because people should care. They should care. We talk about fake news, right?
Yes.
It's important who you're relying on for this information. So I thank you for noticing that, but I learned that in part from you.
I appreciate that. It's an impressive book. It really is. I'm honored to own a copy of your book, and it's definitely something I'm going to tell people about moving forward. So again, thank you definitely for coming on my podcast and educating everybody about recovery and addiction. I know they all get a lot out of it. And again, I'll link to all your resources so they can ask you questions in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You take care.
You take care as well, Joe.
Bye-bye. I really want to thank Tom for coming on the podcast and enlightening everyone. I know the idea of addiction and recovery is something that most of us don't really have any firsthand experience with. So again, I think that he brings a lot of clarity to this issue. And also, again, I never know who listens to me for the most part. So if there are anybody out there who is struggling with addiction, I think Tom is a great resource. Tom is definitely one of the nicest guys you're going to meet. And as proof of that, we were supposed to record this on previous Saturday ago. And, he gave me a call and he says, can we put this off till Sunday? Because he told me he was delivering food to people who were shut-ins because of the virus outbreak. So again, it doesn't get much more kinder than that. So if you have an addiction problem, definitely reach out to Tom. I'm going to link to him in the episode notes. He's very easy to find on Facebook as well. So definitely use him as a resource if you need to. So with that, I'm going to bring this episode to a close with the exception of one last thing, and that is the quote of the week. And again, this one I think is appropriate for all of us who are living in isolation for another week or two, maybe a little longer, but hopefully not. But here it goes. And it is better to be alone than in bad company. George Washington, President number 1. So again, something to keep in mind if you are cloistered inside on a regular basis right now, like most of us are. So again, hopefully you'll take some words of this. I'm Joe Cannon. Until next time, try to make a difference.